Hey, Alysa, good morning.
Hello.
It's a chilly one today.
It's winter. It's snowing. It's exciting.
Yeah, it's not chilly, FTC enforcement.
We would
Okay.
call it white hot.
It's quite hard. So I wanted to talk to you about that today. There seems to be some action there with Rite-Aid, X Mode, with the FTC, and then with the ICO with HelloFresh recently. So let's kick it off with Rite-Aid. What do we need to know there?
Sure. Towards the end of last month in December, the FTC announced a settlement with Rite-Aid, and it focused on the use of biometric information, use of facial recognition technology offered by a third-party vendor to help prevent fraud. And the problem with how the service was being used is that there were a lot of false positives. And so the FTC took issue with that because that was causing consumer injury in terms of the false positives that were put into a bucket of potentially alleged fraudsters. And I thought it was just such a good example of we focus so much on ad tech and advertising and marketing practices when it comes to privacy. But you're not out of the woods when you're using sensitive personal information for other commercial reasons, including fraud prevention if you don't have sufficient safeguards built in.
That's a great point. It's not just targeted advertising. It was about employees logging in. When they received those false positives, was it just the sheer number of them was too much for the FTC, or were they biased? Did they lean towards certain demographics or anything?
Yeah, I mean, this is the issue with facial recognition technology. There certainly has been studies on that it, unfortunately, absolutely, particular demographics has higher rates of false positives than, for example, Caucasian people don't have as many false positives. And so it really went to this issue of algorithmic fairness. You're using machine learning, automated decision making to tee up a decision whether a person is likely to be a fraudster. And that had too high a false positive rate. And I think the question is, well, what's enough? What crosses that line? And I think here we're talking more about low-hanging fruit issues of, did you have a sufficient program at all? What was the thoughtful program? Were you aware of false positives? Were you evaluating it? Were you trying to mitigate that risk? And that would be a dynamic type program, right? Because the data is constantly being trained. And so I think here the issue was having a sufficiently robust program to prevent or at least substantially mitigate the potential and foreseeable harms.
The game's totally changed, where it's not just let's deploy this new technology. It really has the potential for harm in a lot of areas, for bias, for infringements on privacy. And we can't, as a brand, keep rolling with these things without these thoughtful programs.
Right. And I think the moral of the story is it's not that you can't use these kinds of technologies, right? Fraud is a big problem for retailers. So you can use technologies to help mitigate the risk, but it really has to be a thoughtful execution. And particularly when you're using vendor technology, think about that in terms of the diligence beforehand, but then there's the ongoing monitoring once you have that type of technology or vendor services in place.
Well, tell us about X Mode. The FTC's moved on from Kachava or found another place to talk about location.
And I think it's another kind of example of the FTC not looking away from precise geolocation and really taking a hard look about what is the commercialization of precise geolocation when you haven't, again, taken appropriate mitigation measures. And so here, the allegations were that X Mode, in this case, it was in the ad tech context, but wasn't removing from the raw data certain particular sensitive locations like reproductive health care sites, medical sites, religious sites. And because they hadn't taken some of those steps and they were selling the data, that was considered to be an unfair practices because of the foreseeable harm to that. And I think again, the moral of the story is it's not that location data as commercializing location data is unlawful. That's not what the law says right now. It does mean, though, that you need to anticipate what could be potential harms and are there ways to mitigate that in terms of the business practices.
What were some of the differences there with Kachava, just in the facts, or maybe in how the FTC approached it, or maybe even how Kachava and X Mode responded?
I think they're actually really similar allegations. I think the distinction here is that X Mode settled with the FTC. So we have a settlement order, whereas with Kachava, that's in litigation.
Gotcha. And then lastly, with HelloFresh, the ICO fined them £140,000 for 80 million emails that they sent without consent. What do you think of that? You're seeing this contrasted against what the FTC is doing, where they're digging in on personal data. It kind of made me wonder, all right, this was an email, like I get it, but it's not like it's your location.
Well, I think we have both sides of the spectrum, right? We're talking about personal information, and is there risk associated with how the company is using, right, for business purposes, that information? And so on the one side of the spectrum, you've got the highly sensitive personal information that comes with particular obligations. But just because you have a data point like emails, that doesn't mean that you're off the hook either there. And we've actually seen the FTC enforced with emails and not complying with CAN spam recently with the Experian matter. So in HelloFresh, I think the point goes to also data provenance. You've got all these emails. Do you know how you obtain them? Did you obtain them directly from the individual to email, or did you obtain them potentially from third-party sources where you might not have consent to do the kind of marketing outreach, and maybe you don't have visibility in your environment to know the difference, but that's not really a defense to a regulator where you did have to have certain levels of permission to do that outreach.
Yeah, it's funny. And the other angle on it was you send 80 million emails and you get fined 140,000. And ROI is good on emails because they don't cost a lot. So one way to think about it, I'm not advocating for bigger fines, but 140 grand on 80 million emails. I saw somebody on LinkedIn saying that that's $1.38 CPM. Like, actually not that bad. Maybe companies would do that. So it makes me wonder if those kinds of enforcement actions are enough without some serious consumer backlash on some of these things.
I mean, I think about, like, is it a deterrent for other companies, right? Is that the point of the fine, or is it a consequence, a penalty to the company that's in trouble? Because often when you're determining fines by the regulator, you do see the financials of the company and you see their ability to pay. And so the number, it's pretty painful for that company in that environment, even though we kind of in the peanut gallery can say that's high enough, that's too high, that's not high enough. I'm sure HelloFresh, coming out of the pandemic and subscriptions, probably did not appreciate having to pay that kind of fine.
Gotcha. Yeah, I appreciate that. Well, Alysa, when you said that enforcement was going to be a big thing this year, I didn't realize it would happen kind of this quickly. On January 17, we'll be talking about it already with some good examples. So thanks. We'll keep watching it.
Sounds good.